Namaste, friends. I'm Holly Elissa Bruno, and today is the last Monday in February 2024. And I'm glad to be with you. We're coming up on 4 years of this program coming out, this podcast coming out every Monday afternoon. And why are we here? We're here because we either are trauma survivors, which is what I am, or we are close to people who are trauma survivors. And the question we address, invite, work through, work on, need, get help with, help each other with. The question is, can I have a full, wondrous, true to myself, free, authentic, and real life as a survivor? And I ask that because the trauma that so many of us face early on can, as simply said, do a number. It can do several numbers on who we are and who I am, who I want to be, and it can steal away much of who I am. I have learned, my friends, that fear was my motivator for so much of my life. Breaks my heart to say that, and it's also liberating to say that. And perhaps that's one of the principles of being a trauma survivor. The truth breaks my heart, the truth sets me free. I did not experience love as a trauma survivor. My parents were unable. My mother was herself an adult child of an alcoholic, and I believe he was a child abuser sexually, my grandfather. I believe that because of my own personal experience with him, about which I write in the book. And so my mother had no safety either. She had no safety. She was one of 8 children during the Depression when there was no money and a father who was drinking and abandoned the family. There was trauma. There was trauma. And my grandmother refused to accept help. She was not going to be, as the saying used to go, on the dole, which is to say she wasn't going to accept any help from the government, even if the children were starving. Were the children starving? Yeah. Here's an example. We had a family reunion one year, and my cousin Leslie brought a can of condensed milk. Do you remember maybe you still use it? Condensed milk is really sweet and really appealing to children. Just sweet and soft and smooth. And so cousin Leslie heated that up until it boiled down and it was like caramel. And she gave each one of us a small spoon, not a big spoon, but a small spoon. And she said, you can each have 1 spoon, only 1 spoon of this. And I'm sure that we were monitored, as my mother was monitored, to make sure someone didn't take one of those big rounded spoons, which I would have been tempted to do. No, they got to take 1 spoon. And I'm saying we, because at the family reunion, we redid this. And Leslie told the story of her mother, Janet. Janet was my mother's Bobsy twin. They were very close in age. I think my mother was older by 11, 12 months or something. Anyway, we tasted that and it was so sweet. And of course we wanted more, but there was no more. And then Leslie said, this is what our grandmother used to do with our parents. They could have 1 taste of the sweetness. And that was the end. No more. No more. This was in Western New York State, very cold, not so far from Lake Erie. So the lake effect of snow upon snow was happening. And so there my mother was, being raised in a family where there probably wasn't much love. My grandmother herself had serious problems and ended up hospitalized in an insane asylum and given shock treatment. So my mother had a mother who was in many ways probably not there. And my mother had a father who was a womanizer and an alcoholic, and who'd abandoned the kids. He just left them. And my mother tells a story of her grandparents coming, my father's parents coming. My mother had hope that perhaps, I mean, she liked to think that they were wealthy people. And so she had hope that they would come and they would offer help financially so the children could eat. They came. And my mother said, here was their message. Now, my mother was a born again, devout Christian. So in some ways, she got this when her grandparents said to her, children, what you must do, all eight of them, what you must do is pray for your father. Pray for your father. Well, of course, they were willing to do that, but their bellies were empty and their hearts were aching and their bodies were probably cold. I went back and visited that home. It's falling apart, where my mother grew up in Olean, New York. There was a crabapple tree planted out in front. It survived. And one of the things my mother demanded of my father was that he plant a crabapple tree. I didn't know why some things were so important to my mother, but I knew they were non-negotiable. They had to happen. So she had to have this flowering cranapple tree in her front yard. And when I went back to her home that was falling apart, where she was raised, I saw the tree. And I thought perhaps that was the tree she had in heart. And perhaps her mother had commanded her father, plant me that tree. I don't ask for much. That was a phrase my mother and the women in my mother's family used. I don't ask for much. And so when I ask for something, I'm telling you it needs to be done. So I did not receive love. My mother didn't receive love. She was absolutely devoted to her mother, as I was. However, I don't feel she got love there. The greatest thing she could say about her mother is that she kept them together, as opposed to having them placed in foster homes or on poor farms. This was 1930s. She kept them together, and that's what mattered to them all. They were all terrified of losing each other and terrified of losing her. The father, who was an alcoholic and whom they considered to be a godless man, their job was to pray for him. And later on, their job was to convert him. And so as I'm talking only about my mother's family here, my father's family is a whole other story of loss, dysfunction, and deep trauma, immigrant trauma. So I tell the story about my mother first. I say to you that those children were raised on fear, as I was raised on fear. I saw a photograph of them. Perhaps I'll find it. It's 4 of them. It's before my mother. So it's Aunt Esther, Uncle James, Aunt Olive, and perhaps Aunt Alice. And all 4 of them as children are crammed on a horse that I'll tell you about in this meeting. They're crammed on a horse. And one would think little kids riding a horse, yay. But their faces are full of pain and sorrow and fear. And so it's no mistake that they pass that on. My mother passed that on. She strove mightily to have a better life. And she was able to get the better life by having a home of her own, by having enough money to get food, by having enough money that after a while we didn't have the same tuna fish casserole every week or the same salmon loaf every week or the same, oh dear, macaroni salad every week. There are things that my mother, or liver and onions. We had the same thing every week, and I'm sure that's how my mother was fed too. And she didn't like cooking. I think it was a burden to her. So I'm sharing this with you because our topic today in this program of trauma survivors walking each other home, our topic is, how do we remember a painful moment? How do we get out of denial about it? I'll speak of myself. How do I let it emerge? How do I tell it? How do I tell the truth about it? How do I find a safe person or persons to tell the truth to? How do I start feeling what it feels like to relive and retell that experience? And then how, after all of that, can I begin to heal from that experience? And I want to begin by saying, as always, if you're in the United States, please go now to your iPhone or wherever else you go to look up warm lines, not hot lines, but warm lines for trauma. And then you will find them listed, these warm lines, state by state. Hopefully you'll find one listed for your state. I'm in Massachusetts. We have them. Pennsylvania has them. Ohio has them. Tennessee, unless it changed in the last year, does not have one, but it's okay, because a number of states say you don't have to be from the state to call our warm line. Cincinnati warm line. Look that up in Ohio. You can call them. New York City warm line. You can call them. I say that to you because it's hard to know when something might trigger a flashback. And a flashback is really a reminiscence of a very painful time that I probably haven't dealt with. And going back there brings up, the first feeling it brings up is terror. And the first feeling that usually comes up for me or came up for me was a panic attack. I've come to see over my years, 36 years now of recovering as a trauma survivor, I've come to see that a panic attack protects me. How does it protect me? It's so painful, and if you've had a panic attack, you know what I'm talking about. They're scary. They're awful. They feel like the end of life. They feel like I'm going to die. That's what they have felt like. I have very few anymore, and when I feel them coming, I can face them off. I can heal them in advance. I can ask for help. I have all kinds of things I can do. But when they were with me as a threat all the time, they prevented me from living my life. They made me hunker down. I felt I had no choice but to hunker down, to just go very small and not expose myself to anything. The panic attack kept me from going deeper before I was ready. Now, that's a point I want to make. Panic attacks, horrible as they are, serve a purpose. And the purpose they have served for me is to stop me from remembering what might drive me crazy. To remember before I have the tools and the security and the experience and the faith and the trust in place to allow those panic attacks to come. And I don't have to do them alone. What's a panic attack? I would describe it as a instant paralyzation of my brain, so that the only thing that functions in my brain is the primitive autonomic system, the system that can't think straight. This recent part of our brains, the executive function, the part of our brains that allows us to make choices, allows us to see, hey, I've got this alternative and that alternative. Hey, wait a minute. I can look out from a mountaintop and see that this isn't the only thing in my life right now, this horrible feeling. A panic attack paralyzes the brain, and it's done by the amygdala gland, which is at the base of our brainstem, at the base of our heads, where the brainstem through the spine connects. And it shuts down everything except our ability to survive. And how does it shut us down? It gets rid of everything but adrenaline and cortisol. And adrenaline gets me all pumped up. No wonder I can't breathe. No wonder I can't breathe. It gets me all pumped up so I can just survive. And what it does is puts additional energy into my large muscles. So like my legs, they can carry me away. I can run. I can run. And what I did for years was if I could only run out of a building, into the woods, into the green, into the enclosure of a meadow, I was safe. I could not be hurt there. But within the confines of a man-built home, I could be injured, I could be harmed, I could be raped, I could be molested, I could be shamed, I could be demeaned, all of these things. And so a panic attack forewarns me that awful feelings are going to come, and it forewarns me that my body's in a state of survival, and all I can do is all the unit of 5 F's. I can run away, I can do flight, I can fight back if I have the courage to do that. I can fawn, I can try to people please and take the venom out of the person that's trying to bite me and stick me with venom. Or I can freeze, deer in the headlights, and eventually faint. And no predator is going to want to attack what looks like a dying body. I mean, that could make them sick, right? And the last thing, so freeze, fawn, fight, flight, and did I get them all? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Here's the last one, float. Float is to dissociate. Float is when my body is in a state that I can't handle anymore. It's panicking me to death. Or I just can't, or I'm being beaten and I can't stand the pain, or I'm being molested and I can't stand the experience. What my brain knows to do is to dissociate. Dissociation means to leave behind where I am. I'm no longer in this wonderful office. I'm no longer in this great space with windows and colors and the outside and photographs. And I'm no longer in this wondrous space. Instead, I dissociate from my body and go away because I can't stay in my body anymore. Dissociation can be as simple as daydreaming. And for traumatized children, we learn to do this early on. When I was in my 4 years old in my first grade classroom, I would try whenever I could to sit in the back of the class so that I could look in the winter time, especially at the growing fractals, the growing fern leaves of Jack Frost. Back in the day, this is 1949. Yeah, I was born in 1945. So 1949, I would sit there and I'd look out the window, and there were not thermopanes. They just had one pane of glass, and if there was water to be condensed on the inside of the frame, there would grow this beautiful, slowly grow. I could almost watch it. I watched it. That was my dissociation. That was my daydreaming as a child. To watch those beautiful ferns grow. I've always been fascinated by them, and I still am. And they don't come much on windows anymore because windows are thermal paned. But I'm telling you this because when I couldn't bear the pain, either what I was remembering inside myself that I wasn't allowed to remember, or my body was discouraged or depressed or heartbroken, or I wanted to cry and I was not allowed to cry, I would watch things. I would watch out that window, and I'd watch the trees, and I'd watch the seasons. And there was wholeness for me. There was something I could count on. So my friends, what we're going to do, what I invite you to do, if you feel safe enough, is journey with me as I take you back to an experience I had, definitely as an elementary school student, quite young. I could have been 5. I could have been 6, maybe 7. And here's an experience that I've had. And I want to warn you, there is a potential threat here, potential harm to an animal. The animal does not get harmed. I was terrified it would be. And I was terrified it was my fault. But because I was so terrified and so locked in to this memory, I could not recall it for years. Now I'm going to recall it. It's in the book, Happiness is Running Through the Streets to Find You, Translating Trauma's Harsh Legacy into Healing. And you can get this book by going to Exchange Press. Exchange Press. Call them up, go online, order the book. Tell them the word happiness, and they'll give you a 10% discount. Nebraska. Lincoln, Nebraska is where that publisher is, and they have the book. You can also get it on Amazon and other places. It's available virtually. So I'm going to read this to you. And as I read this to you, I invite you to keep your boundaries. If this starts to be scary to you or it feels sad to you, take a drink of water. Take a break, step back, get into your body. Just by activating our bodies, we activate our lymphatic system. By swaying, that gets our lymphatic system going. You can stop listening. You can pick this up later on recording. Or you can talk with yourself out loud, or you can call a friend and say, would you watch this with me? Or maybe you'll be just fine, because this is my story. And I'm sharing it as a trauma survivor. Why? Because I want you to know that such stories do not have to define us anymore. This story does not freeze me into the pillar of salt I felt like anymore. I can tell the story. I can ask for help with the story. I can use all kinds of recovery tools and therapeutic tools to work my way through this. And so I can get out of denial about it. I can tell the truth about it. And I can tell the story now without being overwhelmed by it. And I pray that you too can hear the story with my telling it with confidence, and we can learn from it together. But please take care of yourself as I'll take care of me. And I'm going to start right out here by having a drink of water. One of the ways I know I'm anxious is if my throat gets dry. My throat isn't dry, but my mouth is. So here we go. Thank you for taking care of yourself. This is on page 43. And it's called The Cat, the Hatchet, the Curse. It's the curse that is lifted. It begins with a quote by Pema Chodron. And she says, nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. Nothing ever goes away until I learn what I need to know. Have you had that in your life where things keep revisiting you? Like in my case, I kept meeting the same man. As a lawyer, I can tell you the word was fungible, like jelly beans. I kept meeting the same guy. He was a narcissist. I kept being attracted to him because, as my thought of the narcissist was the key man in my life, I kept hoping that there was a kind, loving person inside this man. And so narcissists would be attracted to me. They would love bomb me, which, as you know, means they would just treat me like I was the best thing they'd ever met. They would give me what I didn't have, which was the appearance of unconditional love. I didn't have the appearance, and I didn't have unconditional love. But that's what a narcissist knows to do. Just praise, praise, praise the hurting trauma survivor until we succumb. And once we succumb, then the cruelty comes. And then, as this story says, we blame ourselves. So yes, modeling on my relationship with my partner, because I didn't know any other way to be, I was attracted to narcissists. And here's Pema saying, nothing ever goes away until it teaches us what we need to know. I have learned not to sell my soul to a narcissist. Am I still sometimes attracted to an altruistic narcissist? That's somebody that appears to be really wonderful and loving. Yeah. And do I catch myself Yes. Yes. Maybe not right away, but I've learned not to fall prey to a narcissist. Let me tell you the story now. I'm going to read it to you. It's about me as a little kid in a little town in upstate New York on a hillside overlooking the Chemung River. It's a very pretty place. The cat, the hatchet, the curse. And now I'll say the curse lifted and the life set free. Our family cat, Timothy, a gray and white tiger, was a mouser, roaming meadows, catching mice. That's what mousers do. Timothy was a house cat by day, resting from his night shift. I was little. I knew nothing of a proper hug or how to treat being smaller than myself. I didn't get hugged. That was not what my family would do. They didn't hug. The only touch I knew was negative touch. It was inappropriate touch. It was hurtful touch. I didn't know how to hug. I had to learn. I literally chose to teach myself to be a hugger. But I was little and I didn't know how to hug. And so I didn't know about proper hugs. I didn't know about hugs at all. How to treat being smaller than myself. I was the youngest in my family, but even if I weren't the youngest, I would not have witnessed a baby being loved because, God bless my mother, she was psychotic and she couldn't handle it. One of my older sisters had to return to the hospital as a failure to thrive baby because even though there was food, everything Maslow said a child needs, food, shelter, clothing, she had that. We had that. We had a roof over our heads. We had formula. My mother didn't breastfeed. And we had clothing, in my case, hand-me-downs. But I didn't know that. I was kept warm. We didn't have hugs. My mother couldn't sustain that. And my father, as a narcissist, he didn't do that. So I was little, I didn't know about hugs, and I didn't know how to treat anyone smaller than myself. I do not recall being hugged or held. I was terrified of that because it usually meant harm or abuse was coming. I liked to feel Timothy's fur on my skin, hugging him close. I did not know how to gather up his hind legs with one hand beneath him. One morning, alone, I was often alone. Nobody knew where I was because it didn't matter to them. The great freedom of being a neglected child is freedom. I was outside. I was outside. And I hadn't learned how to hold a cat properly. So I was outside by the meadow and I picked Timothy up and I hugged him, leaving his hind legs dangling. I liked his purring warmth. Oh, you know what it feels when a kitten is purring? They're so happy, and they're so soft. And I love the protective feeling of his fur. It was closeness. It was closeness for me, and it was safe. The moment was as sweet as the meadow breeze. After a while, Timothy had had enough. Maybe he sensed that there was a mouse nearby. Maybe, that was his job, to get himself the mice. Or maybe he just got tired of being confined. And maybe this is how I blame myself. Maybe I wasn't holding him properly. I just was loving on him. And I was loving the feeling of him on me. So signaling his urge to be free from that enclosure of my hug, Timothy scratched my face just beneath my left eye. In fact, for years I had a scar there. He scratched my face. He scratched just beneath my left eye, unleashing blood. My father, emerging from the house, spying blood, shifted into slow motion deliberateness. His eyes riveted me. I had learned early to stand still, not move, to become invisible. Well, fear drained color out of me. Invisibility could keep me out of harm's way. My father was in a murderous state, one of many. He saw the blood on me. He didn't come to me to comfort me. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He looked at me, you know how if looks could kill. That's how he looked at me. And so I did the only thing I could do, froze. If I could freeze, maybe he wouldn't bother me. Maybe I would just be left alone. But I knew something was terribly wrong. Deliberately, my father strode back into the house, down into the basement where he kept his tools. A moment later, you know I'm frozen here. A moment later, he emerged with his hatchet in his hand. I had to look away because it's so hard to remember that it happened. He had a hatchet in hand, again, peering straight into my eyes. My father turned and then took off after Timothy to kill the cat with a hatchet. The cat, Timothy, was fast. He was fast in the way of cats. Boy, they can take off. Fast and savvy at survival. Far faster than I, even though I had learned to run fast to survive. Unable to catch his prey, my father, predator, walked, hatchet held stiffly by its neck, past me, down into the cellar. If Timothy had died, I would be the cause. If I hadn't hugged him so closely, he wouldn't have scratched me, nor would my father have flamed violent. I froze into a pillar of salt in the yard, unable to move. But where I had caused my father's rage, almost caused Timothy to be hatcheted, I could not live with myself. This was my father's house, not mine. He controlled my world, my father did. I could not stop him to save the cat without putting myself in the way of harm. Shame riveted me silent. I would not speak for decades about this. When adults' actions make no sense to children, children make sense of impossibility by blaming themselves. Judith Herman observes, and she wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery, which is seminal. It's classic. She said, violence or murder threats may also be directed against pets. Many survivors described being forced to witness the sadistic abuse of animals. Because that trusting furry kitten's vulnerability was so close to my own vulnerability as a child, I feared for my life. Finding themselves as the cause of bad things, needing to believe adults protect us, children cannot admit to ourselves that adults harm us. I could not accept the fact that my father harmed me in the night in unspeakable ways and commanded I be silent. I could not tell anyone of my father's beatings, with a leather belt, with the, I can't even say it because it disturbs me, but the end of the belt that's got the latch on it. That's what we would be beaten with. I couldn't tell that to anybody. I had to keep the silence. I had to protect my family. I feared for my life. I got the message. That I was in the wrong, that I had caused all of this, And that, according to one of the first American writers that we know of, not Indigenous writers, they've been around much longer, but one of the first immigrant American writers, Jonathan Edwards, a preacher man, a minister in New England, he wrote, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God." And he talks about holding the sinner like a spider over an inferno. And God drops the spider closer to the flame, and the spider tries to climb up. And again, God takes it closer. That is what I felt like. I was a sinner because I had caused this horrible thing to happen. My father couldn't be at fault. He was the person that fed me. He was the person that built the house I lived in. He was the person that was the God. As a narcissist, he was the God. He was the ruler. He was the Old Testament damning, unforgiving God of my family. And so, my friends, now I'm going to get another drink of water. How are you doing having heard that? How are you doing? Write me if you want to. I'd love to see the chat. Let me see if anybody is writing. Don't have anybody right now. But what I'd love to see, I'll turn the chat off for this moment. I'll let it be. Look, how are you doing with that? It's a very difficult story, and it's a very true story. I couldn't tell it for years because the rule Dr. Claudia Black articulated so well for us as trauma survivors. She said, we were taught, don't you dare tell anybody. Don't you talk. Keep the dirty laundry in the family. Don't trust anybody outside the family. One of my cousins, my Sicilian cousins, used to say, the surest way to hear something you don't want to hear is to tell somebody outside the family. In my case, I couldn't tell anybody inside the family because we were so isolated from each other. We couldn't complain. We couldn't say, I'm hurting. My sister, my eldest sister, taught me when I was 3 years old to stop crying. She said to me, kid, if you don't cry, they won't beat you as much. I knew she was right. She was right. So I had no options. I couldn't tell anybody. I couldn't talk. I couldn't trust anybody. I couldn't trust my father. One day he might be coming into my bedroom for sexual favors one night. Another time we might be at church and he might be smilingly saying, yes, I have 3 wonderful daughters. And why did he do that? Because if someone complimented my sister Lynn, my father would stop that. He didn't want anything to go to our heads. So we couldn't get individual compliments. He would declare he was the father of these daughters, and you gave a compliment to him. Yes, I have 3 lovely daughters. There was never, no one could ever say to him, did you see how Holly swum that race? I mean, she was like way ahead of everybody else. He would stop that person with a frown and say, I have 3 lovely daughters. His message was, don't you give Holly a compliment. Don't you give Lynn a compliment. Because it would swell their heads. Okay, my friends. So I learned to keep that quiet. And I kept that story quiet for years. I kept it quiet for years. I didn't even tell my sisters because it was my secret. That's what traumatized kids learn, to keep secrets. Keep it all secret. Don't tell anybody. And what we say in 12-step recovery is secrets kill. Do you feel that? Do your secrets kill you? I know mine do. In fact, for 10 years now, I have been seeing trauma therapists, one for as long as I could until he was done, and another one as soon as I could find someone I could trust. And I've talked with these people twice a week for years, and then once a week when I was able to start feeling more agency, more capacity, more love for myself. And here's why I'm telling you this. I vowed that I would take to them the things I did not want to talk about. I vowed to take my secrets to them because I felt that if I kept my stories in a secret, I would be the one that died. I was on a panel with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And it was okay to ask him a question. They curated the questions. And the question I asked was, I want to know about the strengths of traumatized children. We know the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. We know so well all of the awful things that befall traumatized children. There must be in the development of traumatized children, there must be something that counterbalances the negativity. That's what I asked him. And unfortunately, that was not a question he wanted to answer or was prepared to answer. So he asked me to ask him another question. And I said, I will. So the next question was related. I said to him, why is it that so many trauma survivors become artists and poets and playwrights and actors and comedians and musicians? Why is it that so many of us take our broken hearts and turn it into art? And the way he answered that, and it's all recorded someplace at his institute, the way he answered that was to ask me what I did. And I said, as I had owned, I was a trauma survivor. I said, yeah, it's a very small child. As soon as I learned to write, I kept a journal. And I've kept those journals. I have them, hundreds of them. I kept those journals. And when I went back to the earliest one I could find, I found my story. It wasn't pretend. I had told the truth in those journals. I told about the abuse as much as I could say out loud. There it was. So I said to him, yeah, okay. So I kept journals. And then I studied English. And then I went to graduate school to get a PhD in English. And then I became a writer. I wrote poetry first. And then I wrote articles. And then I was part of a television program telling the stories, interviewing people. And then, as of this day, 2024, I have written 6 books and I'm in the process of co-authoring another one. So I said to him, I'm an author. That's how I took my broken heart and turned it into art. And he went on to say, look at the many people who are trauma survivors who became artists. Why is that? He also said 80% of trauma survivors take our secrets to the grave. I knew he was right, and I knew that was going to break my heart. It did. My mother never told her story. It was a secret to her. And that's why I think she ended up with such mental illness. In part, she kept stopping her brain from remembering. She had Alzheimer's at the end, but she had psychosis all the time. Didn't know when she would be there and when she would go away. And so I couldn't trust her, and I couldn't trust my father. Who was left to trust? Myself and Mother and Father Nature. I am one of the many trauma survivors who was raised by nature. I was raised by the songbird singing to me. I was raised by the snow that I could sled down. I was raised by holding lilacs close to my face and taking in their heaven's scent. My friends, let's look at how I can use that story for healing. And let me look at 3 ways in which recalling, no longer denying, and then telling, in the telling of our stories to someone we can trust, we begin to heal. So, the 3 steps of healing. 1 is to let the story return. To let the story return. I had kept this locked away in me for so many years, and I was suffering panic attacks, covering it up. But when I found that I could tell the truth to a safe person, and trust me, I vetted these trauma therapists. I interviewed them. The little girls in me gave them the hardest times. Can I trust you? Will you tell me the truth? Will you be honest with me? Will you be loving with me? Will you protect me? Will you listen to me? And then I chose to get over the perfectionism. One betrayal didn't mean this person was out of my life. I learned from my father that if anybody betrayed him, he disowned that person. And so I learned to just kick people out. My trauma therapist apologized to me when I explained to him what he did and how much it had hurt. And he apologized for what he had done. It was an unconscious act, but it wasn't thoughtful, all of what would trigger me. His apology mattered. Okay, so the first thing to recover from these horrible stories that we all have, the first thing is to believe myself that I have stories, that they're in there. My older sister had what is called, dissociative amnesia. She could not remember anything from her childhood, although she would say things like, oh, Father said I could be anything I wanted to. My father always supported me. He always encouraged me. It was the opposite of what I got. My father hated me, wanted me out of his sight, didn't encourage me, told me I was stupid, told me I would not qualify for scholarships. But she got this whole other thing. Did she get that because she really got it? Was she a favored fair hair child? Or because she needed to believe that? She had stories inside her that she never told. And sadly, as predicted by the ACEs study, she suffered for, I think, decades, at least 24 years with chronic progressive MS. She suffered with that. And because our family's principle was grin and bear it, she wouldn't quit. We don't quit. That was our family motto, grin and bear it. Don't ask for much. And don't you dare tell anybody. Because, as my father said to me, it didn't happen, daughter. When I told him something he did not like, he didn't approve of, my seeing gay men, transvestite men in the village when I was 17 years old, the village of New York City. He stood up, loomed over me and said, you didn't see that, daughter. And I remembered his admonition, and I did not believe him. I knew what I had seen. And so each one of us, the first step is to know we have stories inside of us, and the stories will set us free because they're the truth. So the first thing is to believe ourselves. And I prayed and I meditated for years. Before I was ready, before I had counselors, but not trauma counselors. They helped as much as they could, but they didn't know about the panic attacks. They didn't know about the flashbacks. They didn't know what happened to my brain, how it protected itself by going flatlining itself. They didn't know about that. So they did what they could during that time. During that time, that 26 years that I worked and worked to recover from this trauma and asked for help and received the help I could. I did different types of prayer. And one I think was called centering prayer. And part of that prayer was to invite the little child that I was to speak to me, to tell me her secrets. And that I would give her the space to listen to her and to hear her out. And nothing came and nothing came. Basically, I was ahead of myself. I didn't know that. I thought if I could have the memories of the stories first, and then I could really believe myself, then I could know that I wasn't crazy. Because one of the things that happens to trauma survivors is we blame ourselves for being crazy. I don't know if my grandmothers deserved to be put in mental asylums, or if they were the identified patients for their families, if they were the ones that kept all the pain and all the sorrow inside. Both of them had 8 children live, and my Italian Sicilian mother had 14 children born. Only 8 of them survived. How could she not have suffered such loss? And my other grandmother, I don't really know her name. Was it Elizabeth? Was it Louise? I don't know. Was she insane? Or was she put in a mental asylum? Because that's what was done with women that were hysterical, probably grieving. So I wasn't ready. I thought I was, but I didn't have the support to tell my stories like the one I just read you. And so what did I do? I prayed I on my own, well, with help of other people who are trauma survivors. We were all trying to do this, but none of us had, few of us had at that point, trauma trained counselors. And so I just prayed that this little girl would come and speak to me. And I breathed in and I breathed out with that hope that I could be safe enough that she could come to me. And call it whatever you will. I watched this little girl come to me with hair kind of like mine is now. It was like all kind of curly and all kind of all over the place and dark brown. And she came to me and she had on a little white dress. I know the little white smock dress. It's one that my mother put on me or told me to put on myself. I had to dress myself from early on. I'm getting those buttons in the back of those little smock dresses. That was not easy. I had a little white dress with smocking and with some hand embroidered flowers. It was a hand-me-down from both or one of my sisters. And I knew that because if you looked at the sleeve, it was frayed. And if you looked at the bottom of the dress, it was frayed. My mother was in one of her states, her psychotic states. She could get me to the store to have the pictures taken, but she didn't notice that I was in a dress that was falling apart. So I watched this little girl, Nui, come up to me and say she was going to whisper something to me. And what she whispered to me was, I was ready to hear a story. To hear one of the stories like this one about Timothy the cat. Instead, she whispered to me a great secret. We can't be happy, and you can't be happy either. I thanked her. Thanked her. That's the best I knew to do then. thanked her very much, and she went back to where she was. And I wrote in my journal again what she had said. And then as my feelings started to come, I started feeling angry. Wait a minute. I had asked for a memory. Instead, she's telling me another message from the family. I got plenty of messages from the family. It was only on reflection that I understood what a gift that was. She was telling me another family message. Did your family give you unspoken messages? This little girl finally spoke the message. You can't be happy. You must suffer the rest of your life and give it over to God. We all have a cross to bear. So in these remaining moments of this session, I want to say the first thing is to believe that we do have stories. And the second thing is take that belief to a person you can trust. I needed an expert. I needed people who knew how to be with traumatized people. At age 68, I had a 78-year-old clinical psychologist who had worked for years with trauma survivors, who knew to say to me, come twice a week. Come twice a week. So, number one, believe you have the stories. Tell that part of yourself inside of yourself, I believe you. I don't know yet what they are, but I'm going to be patient. I'm going to wait to hear. Once, and then two, ask for help. Tell the story to people that are trustworthy. I told some of my story to people that were trauma survivors, and yet, and the saying of the stories helped me, but they didn't in themselves have the ability, besides loving me through, which was huge, they didn't have the practices to help me face the panic and face the shame and face the fear. So number one, take a leap of faith and believe yourself. Believe you have stories inside. The body keeps the score. Your body knows. It knows. And why allow those stories to hurt me when the stories can set me free? So first, I invite you to believe in yourself. Believe that you have stories within that are worth finding. Number two, find people that are skilled, that you can trust to tell the truth to. And skilled to me meant, because I'm an incest survivor, meant I need an abuse survivor so severe that I blacked out, and shamed so severe that I hated myself, and demeaned so much that I had no faith in myself when I was with those people. So number one, I invite you to believe you have a story worth telling. Number two, ask around, research, find someone that you can trust, and interview these people. I interviewed people before I ended up with Dr. Bernard Gray. And it was the hardest decision. I was in between perhaps someone who was more of a narcissist. Dr. Gray wasn't. I was attracted to that. And Dr. Gray, who I felt would be honest with me. And I chose him, and I worked with him as long as he was working. Number one, believe you have stories. You don't have to carry them to the grave. Number two, seek and ask for help. There is help. Ask around for trauma therapists. Go online, look up trauma therapists. You will find help. Also, so number three, tell your story. Tell it over and over again until the full story comes out and you can live with yourself telling the story. You heard me read. For decades, I couldn't tell that story. Why? Because I was ashamed of the story. I was ashamed that I almost caused that poor innocent cat to die. I was terrified. I could not own that my father threatened my life. When I say that at meetings of trauma survivors, I can say that with complete honesty. My father had murderous rage toward me. I heard him beat my sister. I heard him throw her against the wall. That's what's it called? Witness abuse. I witnessed trauma that way as well. I heard those sounds. I could not get them out of my body for years until I told the truth about them. So it's time for us to wrap up, but I want to end with closing this. Let's close this. I want to ask you how you're doing. How are you doing? You've heard a story that was a very sad and traumatizing experience for an elementary school child to go through. Terrifying, shut me down. I did what I needed to do to blame myself. The other piece of blaming ourselves is that then we feel we can do something about it. And then we feel we've got cause and effect. I could not accept the cause and effect that I was living with a man who was murderous, or I was living with a mother who was terrifyingly psychotic. I could not face that and go into that house. I tried to run away. I was not successful. And even if I had run away, I would have been sent back home. There was not a home to be sent to. So one more thing I want to share with you, besides those 3 steps anybody can take, is this. When you find counseling, I found my counselors and they helped me. I also found something it's in Western Massachusetts, in Northampton, where Smith College and where the college system is. Smith and Holyoke and UMass and Amherst and Hampshire, I think. I found by talking with other trauma survivors, where do you get help? Who do you trust? I would ask. And they said, well, you have to prepare for it, but there is a place called the Trauma Institute, the Child Trauma Institute. Google them. And you can go there and you can work one-on-one with a therapist. And not only do they have a therapist, they have a body worker on site. So if your body gets worn out by telling these truths, you can get help right there. And so, well, okay, tell me more. What does it take? Well, number 1, they said, you have to qualify, which means you have to have been getting help for trauma for some time. I said, oh, I've got that. I've got that. And your therapist will have to approve. No problem. No problem. And you will have to have experience with something called EMDR. I'd heard about it. You guys probably have heard about it. It's the eye movement stuff that I believe helps men more than women. But I said, okay, I'll get that done before I apply to this institute. I will meet with another therapist about EMDR. And I did. And I went through the EMDR. And I took and gave as much as I could. I took as much recovery from that, and I told as much truth as I could. Eye movement allegedly brings us back in touch with parts of our brain we have dissociated from. It helped me somewhat, but it wasn't as profound as some of the men with whom I've talked, for whom they say it's made a huge difference. However, I had that experience. And then I was ready to apply. And then the 3rd step, besides having had significant experience getting help with trauma, 2, having experienced specifically EMDR, 3 was having the money. This institute didn't take regular insurance. If I had, in the state of Massachusetts, had a car accident and trauma had resulted of that, I might have qualified for a grant from that. If I'd been a veteran, I would likely have qualified for the post-traumatic stress disorder that came from that. I have and had complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which means I was subjected over and over and over again to recurring life-threatening trauma. And I had PTSD because I experienced individual, terrifying, life-threatening moments. I applied. I did everything I could. They did everything to help me to get insurance coverage. I did not. It cost me thousands of dollars. I decided to go anyway. Actually, when I went, I was still hopeful I could get insurance. Decided to go anyway. And it made a huge difference. And I'll tell you one thing as we get ready to wrap. They taught me a method called progressive counting. Progressive counting. And the process is this. This is my experience with it. They can tell you, or other people can tell you their experience with it. After qualifying to get help, then I spend a day with a diagnostician therapist, telling her my story, or him. And that person listens closely and puts themes of my life together. One theme was my ancestors' relationship with my father. Another theme was my inappropriate role of taking care of my mother from the minute I could cheer her up. From infancy, I cheered her up. From toddlerhood, she was my responsibility. And the older I got, the more I knew. I had more skills. I could get her to dance with me. I could bring her outside with me. I could get her to sing with me. I could ask her to tell me things that she loved. There weren't many from her childhood, but she had some she could tell me. I knew those stories so well, over and over again. And I could always ask my mother to do a cartwheel for me in the spring. I loved my mother. I pitied her also, and I took care of her. And so the themes were my relationship with my mother, my relationship with my father, my relationship with nature. That was the one place that I healed. Those were three themes. A fourth theme was continuous struggle as a female. Whatever age I was and whatever system I was in, there was the message as a female, you're less than, you're wrong, you cannot do. And I heard that from school systems, from medical systems, from church religious systems. And so, my friend, what I learned in this progressive counting, after the therapist gave me, these are the themes we're going to want to work on. Which one do you feel you can work on first? And so I started telling my stories. And when my brain flatlined because the amygdala said, I can't do this anymore, I said to the therapist, I need to rest for a moment. I need to breathe. I need to rest. I need to get in touch with my soul. I need to ask for help. And when I felt myself returning, my executive function coming back, I said, I'd like to go on now. And so what did I do with that cat story? Here's what I did. I went back there, but I didn't go back alone. I had this imagining that I had learned as a child that I was gifted enough to earn a scholarship if I could just find a place that would accept gifted children. And somehow by asking teachers and by asking around, I found a private school that would help children that were bright that had difficult families. I mean, I think we also went to school with children that were bright and had wonderful families, but there were, in the way I pictured it, I had someone there at the school as my counselor to listen to me, to protect me, to help me through the panic attacks. And so I had gone off. My parents could not say no to me going to a private school when it was announced in the paper. Holly Elissa earns scholarship to study as a gifted student at this private school. So that was my fantasy. And I believed it. And so I was going back into the story. I didn't ever have to go back to that house ever again alone. I could take a counselor with me. And if the counselor could stay in that house with me and it felt safe, I could stay there. If not, I did what I did later. I refused to stay in that house. It was too full of trauma memories. It was too terrifying. Or my father there, just seeing him, or my mother. It was too terrifying. So I stayed in a hotel. After a certain age of taking care of myself, I stayed in a hotel. So what happened in this situation? I pictured myself with this kitten. The first thing was I would have known not to hold the kitten too tightly, so he probably wouldn't have scratched me. But assuming he did scratch me, assuming my eye was bleeding, and my father came out the door and looked at me with rage. His rage was, you can't have anything wrong with you. You've got to be perfect. You can't be sick. I was taught I couldn't be sick. I couldn't go to them if I felt bad. Shut up. I don't get her out of my sight. That was the response. So what did I do instead? I pictured this counselor who came home with me, coming up to me and saying, oh, Holly Elissa, would you like a hug? It looks like you got hurt. What happened? And with this person, I could start crying. And the counselor held me, and I wept because I felt so scared for the cat and felt so scared for my face and my eyes and was just so hurting that the cat that I loved had hurt me. And the counselor listened to me and said, look, sweetheart, that's the first thing I want to do here is I want to tell you that I believe you. I believe you. You didn't want to hurt the cat. Maybe the cat just wanted to get free. You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. You did what you knew to do. You did the best you could. And yes, the cat scratched you. Does it hurt? Now I want to know. I need to know. Let me look at it. Can I look at it? And so the counselor did all the things that a loving adult would have done. And I got my needs met. In that moment, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't blaming myself anymore. I wasn't feeling abandoned to a man with a hatchet who looked at me. And by the way, my father was sadistic. He was sadistic. And so with that hatchet, I believe now he wanted me to suffer. When I watched him kill the cat, he wanted me to suffer. The guilt and the shame of that. It didn't happen, but I suffered the guilt and the shame. So having had this counselor intervene and say to me, it's not your fault. You did the best you could. You were learning how to hug. You're learning that. Some people know that. You're learning how to do it. You did a beautiful job hugging. You held that kitten close. And then when I could let the counselor move aside and my father came out the door with his hatchet in his hand, I said to him, are you going to chop wood? And my father dropped the hatchet. And in that moment, I felt free. I'm telling you this story because it's a way that therapists can use to have our adult selves, our loving selves, whether it's in terms of a counselor coming to help or it's a parent part of us, somebody coming to help, we can intervene in those horrible moments and get set free of them and set ourselves free. So, my friends, how are you doing? Write me if you want to. I'm here. You can Google me. You can go to my Facebook page. You can purchase that book, which has got all kinds of help and questions in it, but it has all kinds of help about trauma recovery. And so I'm going to say, fare thee well. I hope that this session has been helpful to you, and I'll be here with others. I think Denise R will be back next week, so we can talk together about being trauma survivors, walking each other home. I love you. Thank you. And I'm going to stop the recording as soon as I can see how to do that and say thank you very well.